Welcome back to FinTalk, brought to you by Vermec. I'm Jawad Akhtar, your host. So today's the last episode of the season. I'm delighted to have with me Karishma Galaiya, Senior Manager at Thistle. Welcome. Last time we met at the conference, at the Vermec annual conference, and obviously thank you for participating in that. You participated in one of our key panels around senior managers and certification regime. Before I go into the question, I just want people that don't know you just to give a bit background of yourself, and then I'll dive in.
Okay. Well, like you said, name's Karishma Galaiya. I'm a senior manager at Thistle Initiatives. Prior to joining Thistle, I worked in an asset management and platform firm in the compliance team for about 5-6 years. And prior to that, I was a consultant at a Big Four firm for many years. I care not to say how many. Yes.
Excellent. So I know the last time you participated at the annual conference and engaged in the key topic of SMCR. I want to today focus on investment firms. I know that's kind of the work that you do as well. So could you kind of share your key takeaway from the session that we had at the conference and the implication for investment firms?
Yeah, I thought that speaking about the SMCR was actually so timely and just so interesting. I think based on recent industry discourse in terms of the SMCR, especially in terms of the Edinburgh reforms last year and the subsequent reviews that the PRA and FCA came out with, I just think that the areas that we covered in terms of accountability, in terms of individual accountability, and how successful the senior manager regime has been, was just really interesting. And I don't think I expected that we would land there in terms of how well the SMCR has actually been received to date in the industry.
Yeah, because I know we had some polls on the back of that, and there was a lot of interesting points that came out. But yeah, that was a point that where how it's landed was an interesting response on the back of that.
So when the SMCR came out, I think it was such a step change, right, in terms of how the finance industry thought about individual accountability, culture, individual conduct, right? And these things hadn't been thought about before or implemented in firms. So I think, it was just the projects that we were involved in were actually so interesting when moving away from tick box regulation to actually talking about culture, and individual conduct and going through scenarios and so on. So I think that has had a significant impact in firms today. And I think the discourse in industry over the course of the last few years has been, well, we don't really know where we stand with regards to SMCR because there are not many fines or specific case studies that the regulators had set out, right, so that firms could know where they stand in terms of their own implementation of SMCR. So it was almost seen as a light touch regulation, but actually I think based on the conversation that we had, it seems that firms have implemented it, and it has had a positive impact on accountability.
Yeah, it kind of. I remember when it came out, there was a cultural shift. The finance industry was, the banking industry was very, very different then to what it is now. And I think the SMF, all the approvals as well that have to go through, has massively changed it, and all the fines you see that, and the personal fines people are also attached as well. It's fine finding a firm, but actually then getting a personal fine, knowing that you're in that position is.
That's definitely been the key driver in people taking their roles and responsibilities seriously. I think especially in terms of compliance and regulation, right?
Yeah.
That definitely, it's that individual fine has been the key driver here. For investment firms, I think that It came in later than banking firms, right? So, we did have a chance to see how challenging the implementation of the SMCR was within the banking sector. And there are different, it's proportionately different, right, in terms of how you implement the SMCR for different types of investment firm. So the regulators have attempted to look at it that way in terms of, proportionality. So smaller firms have fewer prescribed responsibilities. Larger firms have, like enhanced scope firms, have a lot more. I did, again, from the conversation that we had, it was interesting that smaller investment firms, and fairly so, still think that, the burden is fairly high on them in terms of the requirements that the SMCR poses on them, right? So, and in terms of the changes, I think that was by far the most interesting aspect of the panel discussion, the forthcoming changes. Based on our discussion, I think that, the takeaways are that it's not going to have a wholesale change in the SMCR. I think there are going to be enhancements and, a bit of more efficiencies found in various aspects, but there are not going to be wholesale changes, right, in terms of the SMCR, which was one of the other things that I think, I must say my colleagues and I were talking about when the Edinburgh reforms came out, that we'd spent months and months of our lives implementing the SMCR and, this was all going to be rolled back. But actually, I think, and it's correct, right, in terms of where the regulators are headed in this direction. I think that's the way to do it in terms of looking at efficiencies and,
What was it? It was always one of the questions we always kind of taking note of the questions that are coming through on that session. Proportionality was always a key, and proportionality was a key right throughout the day. But again, like you say, you look at investment firms and smaller and mid-sized firms, not just investment firms, always feel that you can't paint using the same brush. So even though it was interesting to hear that, it was interesting to directly give the feedback back to the regulator who was there chairing the panel, whether those changes, I know they're not going to be wholesale, but those small changes could be incrementally beneficial to firms.
Yeah, especially, I think the 12-week rule was mentioned.
Yeah.
And for me, I think, it's changes like that actually, they do seem small, but they do have an impact, right?
Yeah.
Especially for smaller firms. With the 12-week rule, I remember this discussion very well in terms of, I think the regulator thought that, well, actually, does it 12 weeks should be fine, or maybe just a few more weeks. But actually, in terms of hiring people and hiring SMFs in particular in this market, I think it is very difficult to do in that sort of time frame, right? So when an SMF leaves their role, typically, you're talking about SMFs here, right? So they go on gardening leave very soon, and or they join a competitor, or there's so many, very cases where SMFs will just leave the firm very quickly. And typically, do we have, we have to find a replacement within the 12 weeks. And it's very difficult to do in practice.
Yeah. I mean, notice periods now, for those kind of roles.
Yeah,
it's not 1 month, it's not 1 week, is it? So that's that, and then there's so many other things to add to that.
Yeah.
12. I remember those discussions we had pre this. We were all on the prep calls. They were, that's I remember that stuck with me as well.
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, I've known firms that have taken up to a year to recruit for a role. And the 12-week rule, you have to still keep telling your supervisor or, your contact at the FCA that we're using the 12-week rule and we're rolling forward and we're rolling forward. And it's good that the regulator is looking into that, for example. It's a small change, but big impact.
It's a big impact, have a big ripple.
Yeah.
talking about change, obviously we're RegTech as well. I want to talk about regulatory change impacting investment firms. Is there anything that you see at the moment or coming up that will impact them?
For sure. I think the last few years have been huge for investment firms in terms of the regulatory change that they have seen, right? So we had the consumer duty, the first aspect for closed products, for open products last year, for closed products this year. And I think the consumer duty has been huge for firms, right?
Yeah.
And it affects all firms with that have any direct or indirect impact for retail customers. And so that has been a real key regulatory area of focus for many in the industry. And it's something that firms are still looking at the sort of impact of, right, the implementation. So, for example, in the investment industry, we have investment advisory firms. And right now, one of the key areas of focus is on ongoing advice service provision and really making sure that clients are getting the service that they have paid for in terms of ongoing advice, right? And these reviews that are taking place. So I think we've seen some big names in the news recently, and I think there's more to come, in this space. And so I think the consumer duty, so wide-ranging and so right to focus on customer outcomes. I think it was definitely as big a piece of regulation as the SMCR. So, a big change for firms, especially smaller firms in terms of the way that they think about customer outcomes, moving from treating customers fairly to ensuring positive customer outcomes is actually, it doesn't sound that different, but it is, a significant change for firms.
Yeah, I remember when consumer duty was coming through. I don't think firms really took it seriously enough or really understood it. That was the feedback we were getting, is that it's another regulation, but actually it impacted firms that are not used to regulatory change. Whereas banks are used to regulatory change, they know what it is. It's kind of like it's muscle memory, right? Okay, another change, we know what to do, and it just drives the process. Whereas typically the firms that were impacted by consumer duty, not used to that level of change and that vast work that would have entailed.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's spot on in terms of firms, which had indirect retail clients, because they've always thought of the fact that, well, no, we only deal directly with eligible counterparties or professional clients. So we don't really have to think about, we do in terms of, say, product governance requirements, but just that whole aspect now of having to have these conversations with your distributors, right, who are distributing your products to retail clients, that's a step change. And I think you're right in terms of some of these firms were caught when, they were not possibly expecting to at that time. And I do actually remember the conversations, and it was across the board. It was, seasoned compliance professionals plus industry professionals, front office as well. And they would say, well, why do we even need consumer duty? We have TCF or whatever you call it, TSF or whatever, they wouldn't even know there's like TCF. We have TCF. What's the difference? And I think there is definitely, as has been seen, there is definitely a big step change between the two regimes.
Yeah. So kind of looking at keeping our focus on investment firms, I want to talk about, I know we tackled consumer duty, I want to talk about sustainability regime. I know that's a big area of focus as well.
Yeah, exactly. Sustainability. I mean, I personally love this area. So I'm so happy that these regulations have come out. It's so interesting to me. I think if we break down the relevant regulations, right? So we'd have the anti-greenwashing rule that came out earlier this year. That's applicable to all firms, all FSMA regulated firms in industry. And here, again, it's be fair, clear, and not misleading when you're talking about sustainability-related information, And I think this area is really key for firms to look into adequately. They've got to review all the documentation. They've got to review their communication with what they're saying around sustainability, their websites, what they personally say in client conversations as well, needs to be looked into. There are various aspects that firms should be looking into and making sure that it's consistent and that they can verify these claims and so on. And so I think that's a very important aspect of the sustainability regulations. Then you have the labeling rules. So the SDRs, under the SDR, you have 4 labels now for funds to apply to their investment funds. So here we've seen, I think it's just in its early stages, right? It came out over summer, and I think we're starting to see some of the first batch of funds that have been labeled, that have these new labels. And there are not that many. I think the last conference, which was related to sustainability, that I attended like a month ago, there were about 10 to 12 funds, out of a universe of thousands that have these new labels so far. So I think, it's just getting there in terms of how firms are looking at this and looking to implement these new labels and the naming and marketing regime. Yeah.
I've always been interested in this area as well. And whereas banking regulation and everything else, the data is there. Historical data is there. Property market data is there. Firm rating data, firm information. It's all out in the market, right? We have all that. You can get that information. How I've always found it tricky is how they're going to start gaining sustainability data. That's always still, I think, whereas the banking industry is mature and we know, everyone makes disclosures, you have to have so many bits of information that you had. This stuff that they're asking for is still relatively new. It's hard to get that level of data. So to make a sound judgment on any of that, it's still, I think, in my opinion, it's quite way off. I don't know if I'm miles off it, but is that your thoughts as well?
I think that's exactly why we're seeing not as many funds as expected actually adopting these labels, because actually when you go underneath the funds and into the securities, it's actually very hard to get some of the data that you require. And the data has been getting better over time, and there are so many firms that are that release ESG data and so on. And so there are aspects that are available, but I think for, the alt sector, it is very difficult to get reliable data that firms can use. And it should change, hopefully, going forward, because there are a lot of regulations now that will be coming out in terms of reporting, sustainability reporting, especially in Europe. We will shortly be adopting the ISB regulations as well under the IFRS. So in terms of reporting, I think it will get better in terms of data availability. But right now, I think there is still a challenge. I agree. I think there is still a challenge for many firms to get this data and be able to substantiate some of their claims or, have those objectives in their funds. So, yeah,
it's interesting. The recent focus on diversity and inclusivity, how's that impacting investment firms?
I think this area, again, is so fascinating, right? D&I. And I was really happy when the FCA and the PRA came out with the D&I consultation paper at the end of last year, I think it was. Yeah. And so these papers, they set out a sort of a baseline framework for firms to follow. And I think they include things like targets, links to remuneration, and minimum requirements around this area, and just some expectations on what firms should be doing and thinking about in terms of D&I. It has been, I think, the implementation of this, when the final policy statement comes out, I can see it being quite controversial. I can see it being quite challenging. But actually, again, in terms of proportionality, in terms of reporting on D&I, what the paper is proposing is, for a lot, I think it's firms higher, for firms with more than 249 employees or something like that. So it's for the larger firms, right, to be more transparent in this area. And again, that will provide some additional data, right, for other firms to use, especially when you're evaluating and you need this sort of data when you're trying to implement ESG in your fund or fund selection process, for example.
Well, that's the thing. If we go back to the last question about data, sustainability in the ESG side of it, you've got the S&G, and that all kind of starts to link together, because at the moment none of that data is available. Well, I don't know if you want to make firms want to make that available. I know they have to, but how much of that is quite accurate?
Yeah, I think that there's definite link there, and to have that data will be very beneficial. Again, it's, I don't think that the rules are going to be prescriptive in any way, shape or form. And it's only the larger firms who will have to report more data. It'll be interesting where it lands. And I think there was an interesting point in one of the papers on D&I in terms of the SMCR and the actual link back to, SMCR and the impact that it's had on D&I, which got me thinking in terms of, I'm so looking forward to reading some of the responses and what the regulators' thinking is in this area. Because, for example, we've had clients at Thistle, for example, when we try and get clients authorized in new firms, for example, and you have individuals wanting or needing to be SMFs, but, they say, well, can I take this on as a part-time role? And you say, well, yes, you can, but, you've got to pass certain hurdles and show that you're able to do this role on a part-time basis. But actually, when you go through it, to share prescribed responsibilities, between SMFs, for example, is something that the FCA, there's very little guidance on. And in fact, I think there is wording to the effect that we don't really expect to see this very often. Responsibilities. But I think just going back to the D&I aspect and how it ties in, I think there are individuals who may want to work quite part-time in more senior roles. But because of just the way that SMCR is set up in terms of prescribed responsibilities and your other responsibilities, it could be, it's maybe more difficult, and maybe the pool out of which you can choose an SMF reduces. It could
it's
be
quite small anyway, and then you're reducing it. I was going to go back to a point, when are rules ever prescriptive?
True.
I just want to come on to, we're kind of coming to a close of this year now, or 2024. Your predictions for 2025, and then most importantly, kind of what should firms prioritize?
Hard to say. However, if I was sitting in, say, a compliance team in an investment firm, I would be prioritizing a number of areas of regulation that have recently come in. So IFPR is a key one.
Yeah.
Now, that came in, some time ago now, and the FCA have released some findings from last year as to how firms have implemented the IFPR for investment firms.
Yeah.
And I still think that many of those areas are relevant. I was talking to someone in my team who's an IFPR specialist, and she was saying that pretty much every firm, every ICARA that she's reviewed has some issue. There's some inconsistency or some area to improve. And it's a complex area. It's a highly complex piece of regulation. And I would be reviewing this and getting an independent assessment or getting your internal audit team to review this if possible, just to make sure that when it comes around for the regulator to carry out their SREPs, so their supervisory review and evaluation process, that you're well set up for that, right? So you can, you've got your ducks in a row.
Yeah, IFPR, we support IFPR and IFR, and that's been around for a couple of years, and it's been quite quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, although nothing material has happened or communicated off the back of it, it's been 2.5 years now, and actually I suspect now they'll start to, because they've gathered 2 years worth of data,
Mm-hmm.
they'll start to now go out to firms to review and do the SREPs. And you're right. Get your house in order again. I still think there's still a lot of areas of uncertainty, especially in that regime. So
yeah, it is highly complex, right? And even with the interplay with consumer duty, for example, one of the areas that we've seen is in the wind down planning aspect in your ICARA, where there has been some focus from the FCA in terms of making sure that in your wind down planning that you've considered positive client outcomes, right? And evidencing that. So it's really important for firms to think about all the different regulations and actually how they interplay with each other. So you'll have your consumer duty board report and what you put in there in terms of your consumer duty outcomes and how you're meeting them, has to also marry up with what you've put in your ICARA, what you've put in your other client-facing disclosures or other policies that clients may see. And I think it's really important to consider everything holistically now.
Yeah. Karishma, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I know we've covered a lot there, and I'm sure we can keep going. But again, thank you so much. Thank you for being on the conference, and thank you for closing out this season's podcast.
Thank you for having me.